The studio was alive that Tuesday morning, buzzing with the usual hum of crew members, cameras, and bright lights. But there was something in the air, something no one could quite name yet. Meryl Streep, one of America's most respected actresses, had agreed to appear on Good Morning America to promote her new film. On the surface, this was just another stop in a long press tour, a chance to share a story about immigrant families, about struggle and hope. But if you've ever felt that prickling sense that the ground beneath you isn't quite steady, you'll understand what Meyer felt the moment she walked onto that set. The chair opposite George Stephanopoulos looked comfortable enough, plush and inviting under the glare of the studio lights. But Meyer had been doing interviews for decades, and she knew how quickly comfort could turn into confrontation. She sat gracefully, offering George a warm smile, the kind she had given 1,000 times before. "Good morning, Meyer," George said, his smile fixed, his tone too rehearsed. "Thank you for joining us on Good Morning America." "Good morning, George," Meyer replied, her voice even, gracious. "Always a pleasure." But in the pit of her stomach, she already sensed that this would not go the way her publicist had promised. The cameras rolled. George shuffled his notes in an exaggerated way, making sure the audience at home saw how prepared he was. Then came the question, one that wasn't so much a question as a challenge. "Now, Meyer, your new film deals with some pretty controversial themes about immigration. Some critics are saying you're using your platform to push a political agenda rather than simply entertaining audiences. How do you respond to that?" The room seemed to shift. Crew members exchanged quick glances. This was no light-hearted opener. But Meyer didn't flinch. She lifted her chin slightly and answered, calm but firm. "I think storytelling has always been about reflecting the human experience, George. When we ignore the struggles of real people, we're not doing our job as artists." She might have left it there, but George didn't give her the chance. He leaned forward, cutting her off. "But don't you think audiences are tired of being lectured by Hollywood celebrities? Especially celebrities who live in gated communities, completely isolated from the very issues they claim to champion." The words were sharp, meant to sting. And sting they did. Meyer felt her jaw tighten. She chose her words carefully, controlling her tone. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying, George. I'm simply asking," he pressed, "whether someone who lives in a multi-million-dollar estate in Connecticut really understands the struggles of working-class Americans who are competing with immigrants for jobs." It was a bold accusation, framed as a question, and it hung in the air like smoke. Meyer's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "Are you suggesting that because I've been fortunate in my career, I'm somehow incapable of empathy or understanding?" "I'm suggesting," George replied, his voice condescending, "that there might be a disconnect between your privileged perspective and the reality ordinary Americans face every day." Now imagine being in that studio. The lights felt hotter. The air felt heavier. Producers behind the cameras were shifting in their seats, whispering into headsets, signaling George to back off. But he didn't. He was enjoying the tension too much. Meyer sat back, studying him, letting the silence stretch for just a beat too long. Then she asked, "Tell me something, George. Did you do any research about my background before this interview? Or did you just decide to wing it with some talking points you picked up from a political blog?" For the first time, George's smirk faltered. "Of course I did my research," he said quickly. "That's exactly why I'm asking these questions." "Really?" Meyer's voice carried a new edge. "Because if you had, you'd know that I grew up in a working-class family in New Jersey. My father worked in pharmaceuticals. My mother was a commercial artist. We weren't wealthy, George. We were the kind of people you're claiming I don't understand." The studio crew froze. That revelation cut through George's narrative like a knife. But George wasn't ready to surrender. He leaned back in, desperate to keep control. "But that was decades ago. Surely you can't claim to understand the current struggles of working families when you haven't lived that reality in over 40 years. Meyer leaned forward this time, her eyes steady, her voice sharp as glass. "So, what you're saying is that success erases understanding? That achievement cancels out compassion?" "I'm saying," George countered smugly, that it's easy to advocate for policies that sound generous when you won't personally bear the consequences of those policies. Now the temperature in the studio rose. Camera operators edged closer, knowing something was about to ignite. The producers waved frantically, but George was locked in, determined to score a viral moment. "What consequences, George?" Meyer asked quietly. Her calm was more unnerving than anger would have been. George shuffled his notes again, readying what he thought was a knockout blow. "Well, for instance, you've been very vocal about supporting sanctuary cities. But you don't live in neighborhoods where undocumented immigrants are settling. You don't send your children to schools dealing with language barriers and overcrowding. You don't work in industries where wages are suppressed by competition from people willing to work for less." The silence that followed was deafening. George smiled, convinced he had cornered her. But Meyer was still, calm, her hands folded in her lap. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady as stone. "So let me make sure I understand your position correctly," she said. "You believe that unless someone personally experiences every aspect of a social issue, they have no right to advocate for humane policies?" "I'm saying that advocacy without understanding is just virtue signaling," George replied, almost triumphantly. Meyer repeated the phrase slowly, her lips curling ever so slightly. "Virtue signaling. That's an interesting phrase, George. Especially coming from someone who makes his living asking questions he already thinks he knows the answers to." And with that, the first crack appeared in George's armor. His smile wavered. The crew leaned in. Something was happening, and they all knew it. This was no longer a simple promotional interview. This was a battle. And it had only just begun. George's smirk was still plastered on his face, but it was thinner now, strained at the edges. He had come into the studio that morning expecting an easy win, a chance to corner a Hollywood celebrity with tough questions and walk away looking like the fearless journalist. But Meryl Streep wasn't giving him the satisfaction. If anything, she was warming up, her voice calm but cutting, her presence filling the studio in a way that made even the camera operators hesitate to breathe. "Virtue signaling," she repeated, as though testing the taste of the words. Then she looked George straight in the eye. "That's an interesting accusation, coming from someone who makes his living asking questions he already thinks he knows the answers to." George shifted in his chair, his notes trembling ever so slightly in his hand. He tried to recover, pressing forward. "I think our viewers appreciate honesty, Meyer. They want tough questions about the disconnect between Hollywood rhetoric and real American lives." "Your viewers," Meyer said, leaning on the word, "might also appreciate honest journalism instead of ambush interviews designed to create viral moments." It was a direct hit. Crew members behind the cameras exchanged glances. Everyone knew exactly what Meyer had just implied, that George wasn't there to do journalism at all. He was there to create drama. His face flushed red, his composure slipping. "Viral moments?" George sputtered. "I'm conducting serious journalism here. I'm asking the questions that need to be asked." "Are you?" Meyer asked, her tone quiet but dangerous. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you walked in here with a script. A script that had nothing to do with the film I'm here to talk about. A script designed to corner me, provoke me, and make me fit the narrative you've already decided on." That was when George made his first mistake. He shuffled his papers, trying to regain control, but the notes on his desk were clearly visible. And Meyer's sharp eyes caught them instantly. She leaned forward, her voice steady as she struck. "I can see your notes from here, George," she said. "Do you really want me to read them out loud? Because I'm looking at one line right now that says, and I quote, 'push back on privilege angle,' and another that says, 'get emotional response.' Should I keep going?" George's hand darted instinctively to cover the notes, but it was too late. Everyone had seen it. The producers, the crew, the cameras still rolling live. He had been exposed, caught red-handed. "Those are just interview preparation notes," George said defensively, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Preparation?" Meyer asked, her tone dripping with disdain. "Is that what you call it when you decide beforehand what story you want to tell, then badger your guest until they either conform to it or lose their temper? That's not preparation, George. That's manipulation." For a moment, George looked like he'd swallowed something sour. He tried to counter, his voice louder now, his words sharper. I think you're being overly sensitive here, Meyer.
I'm doing my job.
I'm holding powerful people accountable. The words overly sensitive hit like a spark in a room full of gasoline. Meyer's eyes flashed, and her voice, still calm but now edged with fire, cut through the tension. Overly sensitive? Let me tell you what's sensitive, George. Sensitive is a journalist who can't handle being called out for shoddy preparation and dishonest tactics. The crew collectively inhaled. Even seasoned professionals knew they were witnessing something electric, something that would be replayed and dissected for years to come. Now wait just a minute. George started, but Meyer wasn't about to let him recover. She raised a hand, and the gesture alone was enough to silence him. No, George, you wait just a minute, she said, her voice steady, commanding. You invited me here under false pretenses. You told my publicist this interview would be about my new film, about the craft of acting, about the stories we're trying to tell. But instead, you've turned it into a political ambush, a game of gotcha, where the goal isn't conversation but confrontation. And let's be honest, the only reason you're doing this is to make yourself look tough. The words hit like a hammer. The studio was silent now, the kind of silence that doesn't happen in live television. Even the camera operators had stopped shifting. Every eye was locked on George, who had gone from smug to rattled in a matter of minutes. If the shoe fits, George muttered, almost under his breath, clearly thinking he was being clever. And that's when it happened. Meyer leaned forward, her gaze so intense that George visibly recoiled. If the shoe fits, she repeated slowly, each word like a stone dropping into water. George, do you have any idea how insulting that is? Not just to me, but to every artist who has ever tried to use their platform to shine light on important issues. George tried to interject again, but Meyer pressed on. You want to talk about patterns? Here's a pattern for you. There's a pattern of journalists who've forgotten what their job is. Their job is to inform, to seek truth, to shed light. Instead, they confuse confrontation with insight, spectacle with substance. And here we are, live on air, with you proving that pattern in real time. George was sweating now, beads forming on his forehead under the glaring studio lights. He shuffled his papers again, but it was more nervous tick than professionalism. I think you're taking this too personally, he said weakly. Too personally? Meyer's voice rose, finally cracking through the calm she had maintained. It wasn't yelling, not yet, but it carried the weight of thunder. You've spent the last 15 minutes attacking my character, my background, my motivations, my integrity. And you think I'm taking it too personally? I was asking legitimate questions. George snapped back, his voice brittle. No, you weren't. Meyer fired, and now her theatrical training came alive, her words reverberating with power. You were performing. You were staging a show for your audience where you get to play the fearless journalist taking down the privileged celebrity. Well, congratulations, George. You got your show. The control room was in chaos, producers frantically signaling for a commercial break. But the cameras kept rolling. And Meyer wasn't done. You want to know what would actually be productive, George? She asked, her voice quieter now, but with an intensity that forced everyone to lean in. Listening. Asking questions because you want to learn, not because you want to attack. Having a conversation instead of a confrontation. That's journalism. This is theater. George opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, he was speechless. The studio was no longer just a studio. It was a battlefield. The air itself felt charged, as if the lights overhead hummed louder with each exchange. George had started the morning expecting another notch on his belt, another segment where he could steer the narrative and walk away triumphant. But now, sitting across from Meyer, he looked like a man shrinking in his own chair, desperate to find footing on ground that kept crumbling beneath him. And Meyer, she was no longer just answering questions. She was leading the room. Every word, every pause, every deliberate look had the crew transfixed. She wasn't simply defending herself anymore. She was exposing the machinery behind the interview, dismantling it piece by piece for everyone to see. Let me ask you something, George, she said, leaning forward. How many times have you done this? How many times have you sat across from someone and decided, before they even opened their mouth, what story you were going to tell about them? George fumbled with his pen, clicking it nervously. I ask tough questions. That's my job. Tough questions, Maya repeated, her tone sharp. No, George. These aren't tough questions. Tough questions are rooted in truth. Tough questions demand courage. What you're doing is theater dressed up as journalism. The words landed like a gavel, final and damning. And George knew it. He tried to push back, tried to salvage his authority. You think you're above being questioned? That's what it sounds like. You think your fame, your status, puts you out of reach. Meyer didn't flinch. Above being questioned? Not at all. Question me all you like. But do it with honesty. Do it with respect. Don't come in with a script designed to bait me into losing control so you can call it a headline. The audience watching at home couldn't see the control room, but if they could, they'd witness chaos. Producers waved frantically at monitors, debating whether to cut to commercial, to censor, to salvage what was quickly becoming a disaster for George. But the director knew what they all knew deep down. This was live television gold. George finally snapped. His voice rose, no longer polished, no longer professional. You think you can sit there and lecture me about journalism? You're an actress. You play pretend for a living. The insult echoed in the room. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to pause. And for the first time since she'd walked in, Meyer's expression hardened. Her calm eyes turned cold, her posture sharpened like a blade unsheathed. Pretend, she said, her voice low, almost dangerous. George, let me explain something to you. Acting is not pretending. Acting is telling the truth in circumstances imagined. It is exposing raw humanity for the world to see. And do you know what takes more courage than hiding behind a desk with a stack of pre-written notes? Standing on a stage, night after night, with nothing but your craft to protect you, and laying yourself bare for an audience that may or may not care. The crew shifted uncomfortably. George blinked rapidly, his bravado cracking. You want to talk about pretending? Meyer continued, her voice rising now, infused with fire. Pretending is sitting in that chair, calling yourself a journalist, while doing nothing but parroting the questions your producers think will trend on social media. Pretending is acting like you're holding power accountable when really, you're just chasing ratings. Her words hit with the force of a tidal wave. George opened his mouth to counter, but nothing came. His lips moved, his throat worked, but no sound emerged. For a moment, the mighty interviewer, the man who had built his career on dominating conversations, was utterly speechless. And Meyer wasn't done. She leaned back, her presence somehow larger now, her voice carrying with the weight of a truth everyone in the room felt but had never dared to say out loud. I'm not here to be your spectacle, George. I'm here to tell stories that matter. And the difference between us is simple. I tell stories so people can see themselves in them. You tell stories so people can keep watching you. The blow landed, and George's face turned crimson. He leaned forward, gripping his pen like a weapon. You think you can embarrass me on my own show? He spat. You think you can just waltz in here and... But Meyer cut him off with a single gesture, a raised hand, elegant and commanding. This isn't your show anymore, George, she said. Not right now. Right now, this belongs to the truth. And you can't control it. The studio was electric. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, hungry to capture every second. Crew members tried to remain stone-faced, but some couldn't help the flicker of awe in their eyes. They knew history was unfolding in front of them. George slammed his notes onto the desk, his composure shattered. You don't get to lecture me about truth, he barked. You're an entertainer, a performer. Exactly, Meyer said calmly, the fire returning to ice. And I perform with honesty. I perform with vulnerability. I perform with the intent to move people. Tell me, George, when was the last time your work moved anyone, except to anger or outrage? The silence that followed was deafening. George's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing heavy. He looked like a man cornered, not by aggression, but by something far worse, by undeniable truth. And then Meyer did something unexpected. She softened. Her eyes, still sharp, now carried a glimmer of sadness. "You're better than this, George," she said, her voice quieter now, almost gentle. "At least you could be. You don't have to settle for being a caricature, for chasing soundbites. You could ask real questions. You could actually listen. You could be the journalist you pretend to be." For a moment, George faltered. The anger in his face flickered into something else: hesitation, doubt, maybe even shame. And the audience watching at home, millions of them, could feel that shift. But pride is a dangerous thing. And George's pride was a fortress he wasn't ready to let crumble. He straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening, his fists clenched on the desk. "I don't need a lecture from you," he hissed. "Not from someone who hides behind characters because they're too afraid to face reality." Meyer tilted her head, almost as if she pitied him. "Afraid? No, George. I face reality every time I step into a role. Every time I expose myself to judgment, ridicule, rejection. That's reality. You hide behind questions. I hide behind nothing." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't stretch any tighter, Meyer leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut sharper than any shout. "The truth is, George, you're the one playing pretend." The control room finally made the call. "Cut to commercial." "Cut now," voices shouted through headsets. The screen at home went black, replaced with advertisements for cars and detergent. But inside the studio, the confrontation was far from over. The commercials rolled, but inside the studio, the battle hadn't stopped. George sat hunched over his desk, his knuckles white against the polished wood, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Meyer, by contrast, was composed, still, focused, her eyes fixed on him with the patience of a hunter who knows the prey has already been cornered. When the red light on the main camera blinked back on, the audience at home had no idea what had happened during those few minutes of blackout. They didn't see the producers waving frantically, the stage manager pacing like a trapped animal, or George muttering to himself under his breath, trying to rehearse a comeback that never quite landed. All they saw was the moment the interview returned live, and the thin smile plastered across George's face. "Welcome back," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. "We've been having a spirited discussion with actress Meryl Streep about, well, a lot of things." "Spirited," Meyer echoed, her tone calm, but laced with steel. That's one word for it. The tension in the studio was unbearable. Everyone knew the fight had only paused, not ended. George shuffled his notes again, desperate to steer the conversation back into safe waters. Let's talk about your new film," he stammered, flipping pages as though searching for an escape hatch. But Meyer wasn't about to let him wriggle out. "Oh, now you want to talk about the film?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. "Now that you've tried to ambush me, insult me, and call my entire profession a charade?" George's thin smile faltered. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound rang hollow, forced. "I think our audience deserves to hear about it, don't you?" "Our audience." Meyer leaned forward, and the word crackled in the air like thunder. "George, let's stop pretending for 1 second that this is about the audience. This was about you, about your ego, about proving that you could break me down live on air. But you didn't, and you won't." The crew froze. The director's voice buzzed frantically in headsets. "Do we cut? Do we let it roll?" But the truth was, no one could look away. George's mask slipped completely then. His voice rose, sharp and defensive. "You're twisting this. I was doing my job. I was asking the hard questions you don't want to answer." "Then ask a hard question," Meyer shot back, her words slicing through the noise. "Not a cheap one. Not one designed to make headlines. Ask me something that matters. Ask me something that makes your audience think instead of laugh or sneer." The challenge hung in the air. George opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence was devastating. Millions of viewers watching at home could sense it, the moment a man known for his words suddenly had none. And then Meyer leaned in, her voice softer, steadier, yet somehow more devastating than any shouted retort. You want to talk about privilege? Let's talk about yours, George. You sit there behind a desk, insulated by producers, cameras, editors, networks. You hold the power of the microphone, the power to frame the story. And you use it not to illuminate, not to inform, but to humiliate. That's privilege. The word struck harder than any insult. George blinked, his face pale, his hands trembling. For the first time in his career, he looked like a man who wished the cameras weren't rolling. Meyer didn't stop. She could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of millions watching. Do you know what real accountability looks like? It's not me sitting here answering your leading questions. It's you being willing to look in the mirror and admit that sometimes you're not the hero of the story. Sometimes you're the problem. The studio was silent except for the steady hum of the lights. George's lips parted, but he couldn't speak. And Meyer, with the poise of someone who had mastered not just her craft but herself, delivered the final blow. You tried to turn this into theater, George. But you forgot one thing. She paused, letting the silence stretch until every listener leaned closer. I am theater. And on this stage, you never stood a chance. The words detonated in the room. Gasps rippled through the crew. One cameraman, so stunned, almost lowered his rig before snapping back to attention. The control room erupted with shouts. Kill the feed. Kill it now. But the director's hand hovered, frozen. He knew what everyone else knew. This was history in the making. George sat in stunned silence, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the cameras as if searching for an exit. But there was none. The performance had ended, and he was the one left exposed. And then, with perfect timing, Meyer leaned back in her chair, smoothed her blouse, and smiled. A calm, devastating smile. Now, she said softly, do you still want to ask about the film? The screen cut to black. The network had finally pulled the plug. At home, millions of viewers sat in stunned silence, their living rooms buzzing with the weight of what they'd just witnessed. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips of the exchange spread like wildfire, memes flooded timelines, hashtags trended worldwide. Some praised Meyer as a hero. Others called George a fraud. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had just witnessed one of the most unforgettable live television moments of all time. In the days that followed, think pieces were written, podcasts dissected every second, and late-night hosts replayed the confrontation frame by frame. George avoided interviews for weeks, his reputation shaken, his authority questioned. Meyer, on the other hand, didn't just walk away unscathed. She walked away stronger, her words echoing far beyond the walls of that studio. And you, sitting here listening to this story, what do you think? Was Meyer too harsh? Or was she simply holding a mirror up to someone who wasn't ready to face himself? Would you have had the courage to say what she said, live, with millions watching? One thing is certain. Sometimes, the most powerful performance isn't on a stage or a screen. Sometimes, it happens under the hot lights of a studio, when truth refuses to be silenced. And that day, Meryl Streep gave the performance of a lifetime, not by pretending, but by refusing to.